I'm the Visitor Experience Manager here at Middleton Hall and Gardens. An area of history that has always really interested me is the lives of servants. We often tell you the stories of the lords and the ladies who have lived here, and this is because there's so much more information available about these individuals. They leave behind a much greater document footprint for us to follow. Ordinary people, like servants, didn't leave behind as many documents for us to be able to trace them back in time, and therefore we know a lot less about them and what they did with their lives. In 1841, census records started being taken, and these records reveal to us today the names, the locations and occupations of individuals, including servants who lived here at Middleton Hall. And this wall just behind me here is a snapshot of those census records and reveals the names and occupations of some of the people who were recorded as working here at Middleton Hall. Our census records clearly show that for most of the Victorian period, it was mainly women working in the house, which is why we have chosen to specifically look at women in domestic service in this short video. So, where do women fit into the bigger picture of domestic service? In medieval times, servants were predominantly men, and their roles included steward, cook, groom, falconer and musician, just to name a few. At this time, servants lived a lot more closely intertwined with their masters, and they would often share living space. It was only much later when master and servant space became far more divided. Women working in England during the medieval period could typically be found working as laundresses, chambermaids and even gardeners, but they would mostly have been found working in their home, making products for their family to consume or making products to sell to support their family financially. In Tudor times, some women could be found working as domestic servants, but they were primarily personal attendants to the ladies of the house. Most roles were still dominated by men. By the mid-18th century, more women began to work in domestic service, and the numbers continued to grow into the 19th century. This was due to the Industrial Revolution, which offered more job opportunities for men, which were often higher paid too. As industry grew, male servants were harder to find, but the benefit of this was that domestic service became an increasingly good career option for women. Positions of higher responsibility that had previously been held by men alone were now open to women, and this also meant higher wages for them too. Domestic service was at its peak in the later decades of the 19th century, with an estimated 1 in 3 women working in this sector. The de Hamel family were residents at Middleton Hall during this time, and although they employed men in the gardens and on the farmland, the census records show that they employed mostly women inside the house. Let's see what we can find out about the women who have worked here at Middleton Hall and speculate at what their lives might have been like. Today, our old kitchen is typically quiet, and the old fireplace is rarely alight. But this was the hall's principal kitchen from the 1710s all the way through to the 1920s. That's over 200 years of usage and over 73,000 days of cooking. Can you imagine how many different people have used this space and how many different meals they have cooked? The housekeeper was the most senior role in so-called big houses, but not all families employed one, which was often the case at Middleton. In the absence of a housekeeper, the cook was the most senior female member of staff, and she was responsible for ensuring that her kitchen ran like clockwork. In 1861, when the Peel family were residents at Middleton Hall, Sarah Darling was the cook. Aged 36, she was one of the oldest domestic servants in the house and was supported in the kitchen by Eliza Finker, aged 23, and Emma Fields, aged 18, both kitchen maids. The Peel family were wealthy and had a significant number of servants in residence, which included a butler, a footman, a lady's maid and 3 housemaids. This here is Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, which was first published in 1861. It may well have been used by Sarah Darling, where she would have found inspiration for new and interesting meals and treats to make for the Peel family. This kitchen is actually Georgian in its original construction, but this beautiful little bread oven is a Victorian addition. Sadly, it no longer works today, and I dare not try and open it for fear of breaking it, but no doubt it would have been used by Sarah to bake lovely loaves of fresh bread. So, what might Sarah Darling's day have been like? Well, the kitchen maids, who were lower rank, would have actually had the longest day of all, and would have been expected to get up before the cook to get the water boiling and make the first preparations for the day. The cook would have been responsible for making 3 meals a day and would rarely have had time to relax or take a day off. Her days would have been long, demanding and tiring, but one benefit of being the cook was that Sarah would not have been expected to make dinner for the other servants. This duty would have stayed with the kitchen maids, so there were certainly perks to being in charge. We are here in the Victorian parlour. Now, this room might not have been a parlour at the time. It was most likely a bedroom, along with all of the rooms along this corridor that we are currently on. And the parlour would most likely have been on one of the ground floor rooms. Our records are quite challenging in telling us where different rooms were located in the house at different periods within our history. But what we have tried to do in here is to take some replica items and some replica furniture and recreate what it might have been like to really recreate that Victorian atmosphere. One woman who we know would have worked in these rooms and served the house was a lady called Eliza Buxton. Eliza was born in 1872 and the 1891 census records her working here as a parlour maid. So, what might a day in the life of Eliza have been like? Eliza's duties would have been varied, from welcoming and attending to guests to waiting on the family at meal times. She would have also have waited on the ladies of the house, helping them dress and attending to their needs. Parlour maids also had cleaning duties, but these were often dusting and sweeping, much lighter duties, whereas housemaids were responsible for the more arduous tasks. Eliza's day, like all domestic servants in the household, would have been long. It is likely that she would have risen before the family every morning to start her cleaning duties and then prepared the table for breakfast. Before serving the breakfast, she would have helped the ladies of the house get dressed for the day. In the afternoon, Eliza may have welcomed visitors, served afternoon tea and continued her cleaning duties around the house. The routine would have continued much the same through to the evening, serving dinner and waiting on the table, clearing everything away before attending to the bedrooms. The census records give us some insight into what Eliza's personal life might have been like. In 1896, 5 years after being recorded on the Middleton census, she married a man called Dick Brown, who was the youngest son of the Hall's gardener, John Brown. Eliza married Dick here at the parish church in Middleton village. On the 1901 census, Eliza is shown to still be living in Middleton village with her husband and her 4-year-old son Edward. However, she is no longer listed as having an occupation. The vast majority of female domestic servants were unmarried, and once they wed, they no longer worked. The 1911 census shows the family still living here in Middleton village. Dick is listed as the estate carpenter, and the pair had 3 more children, Richard, Maud and Evelyn. Sadly, the death records show that Eliza died in 1901, soon after the census record was taken, aged just 39. Her cause of death is not stated, but she left behind her 4 children, the youngest only 1 year old. Our records do not tell us the exact location of the Hall's nursery, but there is no doubt that there would always have been a nursery here. One element of domestic service that hasn't changed much over time is that childcare was almost always considered a woman's role. Earlier on we met Eliza Buxton. Eliza's older sister Mary also worked here at Middleton Hall. On the 1891 census, she was recorded as being the nursemaid. She had 4 children in her care: Kathleen, aged 7, Lillian, aged 2, Egbert Alexander, aged 1, and Ernestine Jr., aged just 2 months old. By 1901, Mary is no longer recorded as working here, and there is now a new governess, Dora A. J. Smith, in her place. With the children all over the age of 10 by this point, there would have been no need for a nursemaid, and the focus would have now shifted to their education, which a nursemaid could not provide. The first thing to recognise is that being either a nursemaid or a governess was a position of high responsibility, as you were being entrusted with the safety of the family's children. Nursemaids attended to the personal care of the children, such as washing, dressing, feeding, and taking them for walks. Governesses were responsible for the education of the children, especially the girls, as boys would often be sent off to boarding school. It was essential that the governess was well educated, and they almost always came from middle-class families. Dora is the perfect package by Victorian standards. Aged 26 in 1901, she is well educated, having attended boarding school herself. She is from a middle-class family, and she is the daughter of a clergyman. Dora would likely have found herself ensuring that the younger children were up to scratch with reading, writing and arithmetic, whilst the older daughters would have received instruction in playing the piano, learning French, dancing and the appropriate behaviour for young women. They may also have received lessons in basic history and geography. Although governesses were higher status than nursemaids, both roles were more closely integrated into family life than any other servant role. Many women had a greater input into the upbringing of the children than the parents themselves, and they often travelled with the families on outings and trips, which wouldn't have been the case for the housemaids and parlourmaids, who were expected to be seen and not heard at all times. Nursemaids and governesses were often with families for many years, and likely grew very attached to the children in their close care. When they were no longer needed, either because the children were mature enough to be without care, or because they needed a governess rather than a nursemaid, women were sent away, which would have been a very painful experience for them after caring for a family for so long. This is now the only stairway leading up to the attic, but there were once multiple staircases that have long been demolished. This one is actually a modern addition that was put in the 1980s. We know that from the 1600s, attics, or garrets as they were then known, were used as servants' quarters here at Middleton Hall. They were used especially for the housemaids, and the multiple staircases meant that they could easily live in their own separate quarters. Historians believe that at one time all of the attics in all of the different buildings at Middleton were connected and accessible from various different points. The principle of servants being seen and not heard was embedded into its structure. All around the hall, random floating doors can be found as a testament to a time when all of the attic spaces used to connect. Men and women, of course, would have had separate bedrooms. They would likely have had a single bed and been sharing with at least one other person. They might have also had a dresser or a container for their personal belongings. Living conditions would have no doubt been uncomfortable. They would have been freezing in the winter and boiling hot in the summer. There are some interesting features up here in the attic. There is a fireplace here which has obviously not been used for a very long time, but is evidence that this was a living space. Let's hear from site manager Joanna Haybart to find out more about the architecture inside the attic.
So when the servants lived up here, they wouldn't have seen it in the way that it looks now. It wouldn't have been bare beamed. We know this because these marks on the beams are nail holes. And so onto these beams we know laths were put and plaster over the top. So it would have looked and felt more like a room with slanted ceilings rather than the bare attic space that it looks like today.
In 1924, Middleton Hall was bought by John Averill and his family. The Averils were different to past owners because there were few, if any, domestic servants employed to work in the house itself. We recently spoke to the grandson of John Averill, also called John Averill, who said his family employed staff to work with them rather than for them, and the whole family got stuck in one way or another. The Averills were certainly progressive in their attitudes towards domestic service, but this sentiment also represents a wider change as domestic service was largely in demise by the mid-20th century. I hope that you have enjoyed this brief journey exploring the lives of some of the women who have worked here at Middleton Hall. Records for servants are so few and far between that we will never know even the names of the majority of servants who have worked here. However, next time you walk the corridors and rooms of Middleton Hall, remember that you are following in the footsteps of hundreds of servants and that their stories are as fascinating as any other.